Grief is a normal response to loss, whether it's the passing of a beloved spouse or a treasured pet. Grief can also take hold when faced with divorce, unemployment, or the onset of a disability or health condition. In this video, I will discuss 5 circumstances that can cause grief to become stuck. This is called complicated grief or prolonged grief disorder. And watch until the end of this video as I will discuss why a diagnosis of prolonged grief is so controversial at the moment. Let's look at the first cause of prolonged grief. Previous losses or trauma. If you have experienced multiple losses or have a history of trauma, you may be more susceptible to prolonged grief disorder. For example, Lisa experienced several significant losses. As a child, she lost her father to a sudden heart attack, and in her teenage years, she lost her best friend in a tragic accident. Each loss had a profound impact on Lisa, but she never had the opportunity to fully process and grieve these losses. So when her mother passed away, she found herself overwhelmed by a complex mix of emotions. Every time she thought of her mother, she felt flooded with grief. So the unresolved grief from her past compounded the intensity of Lisa's grief. She experienced heightened emotional distress, persistent feelings of sadness, and difficulty finding meaning in life. It's now 5 years since her mother died, and Lisa still feels unable to enjoy life as she feels it holds no meaning. And her religious beliefs, which used to provide comfort, suddenly feel shaky and uncertain. So you can see that Lisa's history of multiple losses and unresolved trauma contributed to the development of complicated grief. A sudden or traumatic loss. When the death of a loved one occurs suddenly or unexpectedly through an accident, suicide or murder, it can significantly impact the grieving process. For example, Mark's son died in an accident at work. The sudden and traumatic nature of the loss left Mark in a state of disbelief and profound grief. He experienced intense feelings of shock, confusion, anger, and overwhelming sadness. The abruptness and nature of the loss made it difficult for him to comprehend and accept the reality of his son's death. It's now 5 years after the loss, and Mark has not returned to work. He feels unable to resume his life as normal. It's like he's lost in a maze, struggling to find solace and make sense of the loss. Now, usually the grieving process involves a gradual adjustment to the loss over time, but complicated grief is characterised by intense and prolonged grieving that can persist for years. So the unexpected and traumatic nature of the death, along with the associated shock, contributed to the development of prolonged grief disorder. Lack of social support. Adequate social support plays a crucial role in coping with grief. If you do not have a strong support system or lack access to supportive relationships, it can make the grieving process more challenging. For example, Susan lost her partner John to a sudden illness. They'd been in a committed relationship for several years and shared a deep emotional connection. After John's unexpected passing, Susan found herself grappling with intense grief and a sense of profound loss. Unfortunately, she lacked a strong support system to lean on. She'd recently moved to a new city for work, her family were far away, and she had no close friends. The lack of close relationships compounded her feelings of loneliness. She often found herself ruminating on the loss without the opportunity to talk through her feelings. She yearned for a listening ear, someone who could provide empathy and validation during her grieving process. The lack of social support and absence of close relationships intensified Susan's grief and contributed to the complexity of her grieving process. Personal vulnerabilities. Certain personal characteristics and vulnerabilities can increase the risk of developing prolonged grief disorder. These may include a history of mental health issues such as depression or anxiety, difficulty regulating your emotions, or tendency to ruminate or excessively focus on negative thoughts. For example, Martin had a long-standing history of depression and struggled managing his emotions. He often found himself overwhelmed by intense sadness, anxiety, and negative thoughts. When his close friend passed away unexpectedly, his grief was further complicated by his pre-existing vulnerabilities. The loss triggered a cascade of intense emotions, including deep sorrow, guilt, and anger. Martin blamed himself for not being there for his friend, and these thoughts consumed him, leading to feelings of guilt. His personal vulnerabilities, including his history of depression and difficulty regulating emotions, increased his susceptibility to prolonged grief disorder. A conflicted relationship with the deceased. Complicated grief is more likely when the relationship with the deceased was characterised by unresolved conflict. For example, Sarah's mother was verbally abusive, so when she died, Sarah felt a mix of sadness, relief, and guilt. The relief stemmed from being released from the abuse, but this generated a deep sense of guilt. Sarah thought, "I shouldn't feel relieved that my mother has died." Immediately after her mother's death, Sarah stopped paying attention to her appearance, she started to binge eat and withdrew from her friendship circle. It's now 18 months since her mother passed, and sadly things haven't improved. Sarah barely leaves the house and spends her days experiencing persistent and intrusive thoughts about her mother. Sarah's conflicted relationship with her mother added a layer of complexity to her grief and contributed to the development of prolonged grief disorder. Is prolonged grief a disorder? Grief is a normal human response, but prolonged grief disorder is now an official psychiatric diagnosis. The 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, also known as a DSM-5, now deems prolonged grief as a distinct diagnosis. Now, a lot of mental health professionals are in conflict about this. One camp believe we are pathologising something that's normal, we are stigmatising grief and medicalising it. The other camp believe that a diagnosis of prolonged grief can help validate people's pain and give them accurate language to describe their symptoms. Now, according to the DSM-5, to meet the criteria for prolonged grief disorder, the loss of a loved one had to have occurred at least a year ago for adults and 6 months ago for children. And to meet the diagnosis, you will have a strong yearning for the deceased, as well as at least 3 of 8 psychological states: disbelief, intense emotional pain, meaninglessness, loneliness, avoidance of reminders, numbness, lack of engagement, and identity disruption. So, prolonged grief disorder is a persistent, incapacitating form of grief. But do you think it's a helpful diagnosis, or do you think it's pathologising grief? Let me know in the comments. And if this video has been helpful to you, please view my video on how grief can impact the body. Just click the screen to view the video. And I look forward to seeing you soon.